Hello, good morning. Welcome to the Sunday Show. I'm Martin Geissler. This weekend marks the 5th anniversary of the first COVID lockdown in the UK. The pandemic impacted every one of us and it claimed more than 16,000 lives here in Scotland. 5 years on, I've been speaking to Jeane Freeman, Health Secretary at the time. How does she reflect on the decisions that were made and how prepared would we be if it all happened again? Also, are young men in crisis? Sir Gareth Southgate delivered a lecture this week warning too many vulnerable boys are falling victim to, in his words, callous, manipulative and toxic influencers. Well, joining me in the studio are two members of Royston Youth Action who are offering a place for young men to experience positive masculinity. We'll find out what that's all about. And after that, it is over to Andrew Black on the radio and on BBC Sounds. Hi, Andrew.
Hi there, Martin. We're going to be spending a bit of time today looking at how the pandemic has affected our young people. We're also looking ahead to the Chancellor's big economic statement in Parliament next week. What might that mean for Scotland's finances? And scientists are warning that almost a third of the world's glaciers could be gone in the next 25 years. We're going to assess the impact of that.
All right, Andrew, great stuff. Andrew will be with us on the radio at 10:30. Let's get on with the show. Yeah, I'm sure you're going to have your own thoughts on both of those topics this morning. If you want to share them with us, you can. Just use the hashtag BBC Sunday Show. Now, 5 years ago this weekend, we went into lockdown. Seems like a lifetime ago in some ways, but the memories are still very fresh for many of us. It had more of an impact than most of us could have predicted at the time, and the legacy of COVID is still being felt by many of us today. Kids missed out on interaction and education. Cancers went undetected. More than 16,000 people died across Scotland. COVID's still here, by the way, but 5 years later, life has, of course, largely returned to normal. Anniversaries, though, offer a chance for a bit of reflection. So I sat down with Jeane Freeman, who was the Health Secretary at the time, to hear her thoughts on the pandemic and the decisions that were made. Jeane Freeman, 5 years is quite a long time, doesn't feel like it for a lot of people. I just wonder, reflecting on the pandemic, the impact it had on everybody, the impact it had on you, how do you feel 5 years on?
I think for me, my reflection is that it was both an awful time and an extraordinary time. So it was awful for people, for the country to be confronted with a virus that had the serious potential of causing death and harm that we were learning about as we go. And it had an awful impact on many people. At the time, people lost loved ones. People couldn't be with loved ones if they were ill, couldn't be with others if they were at a funeral. People lost opportunities, particularly young people, I think, who lost those occasions that only come once. You know, your first year at university or college, but you're doing it online, your transition from primary to secondary, your graduation. So in all of that, people in business, it was an awful time, but it was also an extraordinary time, Martin, because you saw our NHS at its very best. You saw our social care staff at their very best. But you also saw communities who, unasked, came together and sorted out things like prescription runs, food deliveries, phone call trees, all sorts of things. So thinking back to it, I think it was both of those. It was awful and it was extraordinary.
You reeled off a whole load of the hardships that people had suffered during COVID in your previous answer, and they were all, in the main, down to the decisions that your government have made. So I want to just look through a few of those at the moment. Full, strict, lengthy, punishing in many cases lockdown. Just take us into the room if you can, if you were in the room when the decision was made that there is no alternative but to do this. Did you have any idea at that point what the impact might be? Yes, I did. It doesn't take a lot to think through in human terms what it means to tell people to stay at home, businesses to close, kids not to go to school. It doesn't take a lot, really,
to put yourself in that place and imagine what that means. And there were a lot of decisions that were difficult for people to do, impactful, harmful. What I would say is the alternative would have been worse. Our job, my job as part of government, was the most important job that any government ever has. And that is keep the people of your country safe. Do everything you can to keep them as safe as you can.
So here's probably a very good example of that, of the fact that every decision you made thinking for the best would have a negative consequence. In your brief, in the NHS, cancer screening was reduced. Obviously, that is a matter of life and death. How heavily did that weigh on you? Did you have any impact assessment?
Yes, we did. I knew the numbers we were talking about. And of course, you know, if you're the health secretary, you cannot but be very conscious of the importance of screening programs. I mean, why do you do them? You do them because you know, as a matter of clinical fact, that the earlier cancer is caught, the greater the chances are that people will survive. So if you stop screening, you can't not know that you're causing harm. So it was probably one of the decisions that weighed most heavily. But what I'd say is, we all have a tendency to do this in our everyday lives, and that is to think that every decision is binary. There's a right thing to do and there's a wrong thing to do. It was never, ever like that. There was never a binary decision in any of this. There was a harmful thing to do, a more harmful thing to do. It was a risky thing, a more risky thing. And that was the constant judgment.
There are decisions that were made which, in retrospect, one might be forgiven for thinking you should have seen the harm, the obvious harm that would come. I'm talking, you won't be surprised to learn about care homes, and the decision to take people out of the most dangerous environment, perhaps hospitals, which were full of COVID, and put them without proper testing, without necessarily knowing whether they had COVID or not, into the most vulnerable locations, care homes where the most frail, fragile, elderly population were. Looking back on that now, does that not seem like a crazy decision?
In the circumstances that we were in at the time, no, it doesn't. And the reason it doesn't is because if I could have tested at the outset every single resident going into a care home, I would have tested them. But we did not have the capacity to run those tests and process them. And the second thing I'd say is that every care home is signed up to the National Manual for Infection Prevention and Control. It's basic, what you would call barrier nursing. It's common sense, basic. So in residents going into care homes from hospital, they were required to isolate in their room, to be barrier nursed, infection prevention and controlled nurse, in order to try and prevent any transmission from one resident to another as far as you could. Now, care homes could refuse to take people, and some did, because they had a level of anxiety that meant that they didn't want to do that. But a care home, which is a home, with that level of infection prevention and control, with the PPE support that we gave them, is a much safer place than a hospital which is treating COVID patients. You make the best decisions you can in the circumstances you're in with the information and the resource you have at that time.
So no regrets?
Oh, I regret that people died. I regret the harm that was caused. Of course I do. I'm human like everyone else. But I still believe that I made the best decisions that I could in the circumstances I was facing at each moment in time. And I was able to improve matters as we went along, for example, as our testing capacity increased.
I don't think anybody watching or listening to this can really probably imagine what you know, the enormity of the responsibility that you must have felt at that time and the complexity of the decisions that you were making. But nonetheless, there will be people watching this who are still very angry about what happened, bereaved people who are still very angry. Can you understand their anger?
Oh, I absolutely can. I absolutely can understand their anger. Of course I can. That doesn't diminish their anger, nor, I'd say, does it diminish what I'm saying to you. I made what I believed were the best decisions with the information I had at the time. And as I could improve the circumstances, I absolutely did. But there is no getting away from the fact that people died, people were harmed, and there is a long-term impact. There's a long-term impact on long COVID. There's a long-term impact on people who were bereaved, who never had the chance of a proper funeral with as many of those they wanted there to be there. They may not have had the opportunity to sit with their loved one as they died. Young people who have not had the kind of growing up experiences that you had or I had, that are just part of the passages of life. All of that, of course, I'm deeply conscious of that impact. But I'd still say to not do some of the things that we did, make the decisions that I and others made, would have been worse.
On young people, on schools, Jason Leach has said relatively recently, I made some missteps. What we did because of the knowledge we had at the time. I don't know if we'd do it the same way again because we had different knowledge now. He says, I wonder if closing the schools is something that we'd reconsider. Do you think that might have been a mistake?
I think it's something worth reconsidering. I don't know, because I'm not sitting now with all the information that I had then. In 5 years, I don't remember it all. So I can't say for sure that was the wrong decision. But I think it is a decision, actually many of them are probably worth a reconsideration. And there's certainly things to be done to prepare us to be in a better starting place than we were for the next pandemic that will come along.
As far as you're aware, is there a blueprint now based on what we've learned? Is there something on the shelf that we can take down to make sure that absolutely best practice is followed and mistakes are learned from?
So I don't know that for sure. I know that even from
extraordinary if there wasn't, wouldn't it?
Even from the summer of 2020, when I was still in government, we were conducting what were called lessons learned reviews. And there's been a lot of work done, for example, on PPE and stockpiling of PPE in order to make sure that it doesn't go out of date, but you keep a decent stockpile. My biggest worry would be our baseline testing capacity, that you need to maintain that at a higher level than it was at the start of the COVID pandemic. And you need to be quick to scale it up. But there was a lot of work done, even during my time when we were still in the middle of the pandemic, up to May 21, where we were looking back and saying, we need to, what have we learned from that? What can we do better? The only thing I'd say is, there's a lot of talk about, you know, are you prepared for the next virus? I think you can be prepared in terms of your infrastructure and your resourcing. What you can't be prepared for is how any new virus will operate, how it will transmit, who it will impact most on. You need to wait till you've got it in front of you.
Well, what we do know in terms of infrastructure and resourcing is that our hospitals are absolutely bursting at the seams. So that's a pretty bad start, isn't it?
Well, I think certainly the elective hospital programme is, which was there when I was the health secretary, is a major contributor to our A&E departments, for example, being able to function as we would want them to function. Personally, I think we could do better if we had a national booking service, for example, or even a regional booking service for elective work to get the most productivity out of our theatres. So there are things I think that could be done, but at the minute I'm like you, I'm sitting outside of that, and it's always easier to say what you think should be done than when you're inside it trying to do it.
What about the politics of it, cross-governmental relations? How did they work? There was a suspicion that some of this was being politicised, difference for difference's sake. Look at us, we can run it separately and we'll do it better. Is that...
Yeah, that's always an interesting question, because the framing of that question always implies that Scotland was deliberately setting out to be different from England. Actually, if you look where there were differences, what you will find is that Scotland, Wales and Northern Ireland were going in one direction and England was going in another.
Was it difficult?
So the differences are not the way that they are often portrayed. Was it difficult? Occasionally it was difficult, but actually, and I've said this before, every Thursday, the 4 health secretaries of the 4 nations would have a Zoom call to catch up on what we were doing, to try and thrash things out, to make sure everything was working okay, and where there were perhaps issues of whatever it might be, that we could resolve them. Equally, where we could understand why we were doing something different from another. And those were very useful and very collegiate. So in those relationships, I didn't find it difficult at all. The problem I sometimes had, as my colleagues in Wales and Northern Ireland I think would say too, is that we could be having a discussion with the Secretary of State for Health in the UK government on a Thursday, which by the Sunday papers, the end result of which would have completely altered. Now that is difficult.
You're very robust in your defence of the way things worked. You've clearly thought through the pros and cons in the decision process. I mean, there must have been really bad times. There must have been nights when you were in bits over all this.
Of course. Of course. I described it as 2 years of running anxiety. So you're always anxious. There's anxiety about everything, from whether you're making the right decisions to whether what you've said needs to be done is getting done. Is it being done properly? What's going wrong that you don't yet know about? To just anxiety that everybody had about your own relatives, loved ones, how they're all doing, hoping they don't get ill, hoping everything will be okay for them.
5 years on, do you look back with a sense of pride?
I think pride's the wrong word. Actually, I think I look back proud of what our NHS did, proud of how quickly Louisa Jordan was constructed. I went to see it during its construction, and they did it in such a short space of time and on budget. So I'm proud of how people responded, and of our NHS, our social care staff, our public service, and how ordinary people responded. I am pleased at my own resilience. I think that's what I'd say about me.
Jeane Freeman, thank you very much indeed for your time.
Thank you.
Well, you can hear the full version of that interview on an extra bonus episode of the Scottcast podcast, which will be in your feeds later today. Just search for Scottcast on BBC Sounds or wherever you get your podcast. You'll find that there, hopefully, this afternoon. Also, I should say, Reporting Scotland are doing an extended hour-long episode on BBC One Scotland tomorrow evening, looking back at COVID and lockdown and the pandemic and the impact it had. Right, the former England football manager, Sir Gareth Southgate, has been roundly praised this week for highlighting a topic that many people feel gets too little attention: the pressures young men are facing and the lack of positive role models in their lives. Delivering this year's Dimbleby lecture, Sir Gareth said boys are increasingly isolated and in crisis. He talked about what he described as the harmful effects that callous, manipulative and toxic influencers are having on a whole generation. Here's a bit more of what he had to say.
Young men are suffering. They're feeling isolated. They're grappling with their masculinity and with their broader place in society. As real-world communities and mentorship declines, young men end up withdrawing, reluctant to talk or express their emotions. They spend more time online searching for direction and are falling into unhealthy alternatives like gaming, gambling and pornography.
Well, is Gareth Southgate right? And if he is, what do we do about it? Royston Youth Action Group have had a look at all this through a project called Imagine a Man. They described it as a positive masculinity project. I'm pleased to say, well, Colin McHugh, who took part in the project, and Conor McKee, who's a youth worker with the group, are both with us this morning. Morning, guys.
Morning.
Thank you very much indeed for being with us. Colin, let me come to you first. What did you make of what Gareth Southgate had to say? There's always a danger. The whole point of this, I guess, is there's a danger that when one generation talks down to the generation below it, we feel we seem really out of touch. Do you think he nailed it?
I think he nailed it. I think the platform that Gareth Southgate has, like, are not a lot of people that has the platform that he has. Like you said, like, obviously said stuff that he said. Like, I think it's very truthful, especially the point where he said gaming, gambling, porn. I feel like a lot of more young men, especially, suffer with a feeling of emptiness, and then they can be like quick dopamine hits, quick fulfillments for that emptiness. If you get me.
Well, why do they have a feeling of emptiness, this generation?
I don't know. I feel like something's missing a lot of the times. Like, there's like a lack of like things to do these days. Like, especially like social media, you could go scroll on your phone, get a quick dopamine hit. You could spend hours on your gaming console, and then you could get a dopamine hit, and then you could crash right after it.
Yeah, Conor, you're a youth worker, so I mean, do you see this? Do you see real evidence of this every day?
Yeah, unfortunately, especially through the things like the pandemic that we've been talking heavily on this morning, there has been a significant drop-off in the number of young people actually attending the clubs. So they are in isolation and they are withdrawn from kind of real-life social settings. And
there's a drop-off in the number of clubs generally around the country. I mean, that's part of the problem, isn't it? There's a lack of places for young men to go where they can have that sense of belonging, right?
Yeah, exactly.
Yeah.
I mean, what do you do about this then? You've had this project, Imagine a Man. What are you doing to try and fix this problem, Conor?
So, yeah, we provide a local youth club in the area of Royston where we work, and on a weekly basis we run our boys and girls health group. So we try and tackle this by just having really open and frank and honest conversations with the young men in the club. We also had Colin a part of things like the Imagine a Man project. So really working in partnership and just trying to support all that kind of learning in the community.
I mean, the problem is we've got you on here because it's quite unusual that you guys are providing something like this. Most communities don't have anything like that, right, Colin?
Mm-hmm. Yeah, exactly. Like, not a lot of communities have stuff like this because I feel like there isn't a lot of there's not like a variety. There's not enough funding for like youth groups as well. Like, there's like, you go a lot of places and you won't see a lot of youth groups, especially like Royston Youth Action's like a great youth group. I'd definitely recommend a lot of people to go to it, but I feel like a lot of people just like find like easier options like going and gaming and stuff like that, like rather than socialising.
Have you, I mean, do you not, so there's a concern, right, with young men that they'll just shut the bedroom door and shut themselves off from the rest of the outside world and just get sucked into this big online community
100%.
where all these negative influences are. Do you do that at all now, or do you not look at screens?
Like, obviously we have the like usual scrolling again now in TikTok and like Instagram Reels and stuff. But when I was younger, I was like quite a shy person. I used to like isolate myself. Like, it was about when I was like a young teenager. I used to isolate myself in my room, like quite darkness all the time, just sit on my phone. I would just sit and gaming all the time. Like, that's all I would do literally with my life, just waste my life away, just not socialising. I wouldn't speak to anybody in school as well because I was just not confident at all because I was just isolated in this online world.
So what changed?
What changed? I finally grew up a bit and decided to like get out of my comfort zone because one of my pals dragged me to the youthie, like the Royston Youth Action, and then started meeting new people, meeting new youth workers, and my confidence started growing. I started meeting a lot of new people.
There's an issue, I think, Conor, that you know, or it's been suggested that young men don't really get a chance to celebrate being men in the same way as young women are always told, celebrate being a woman, be proud to be a woman. And there's the notion is, right, that young men just never get told to be proud of being a man. So people like Andrew Tate or whoever, these influencers that Gareth Southgate's talking about, come into that vacuum and say, this is what it's like to be a man. And they portray quite what most people consider a negative version of that. I mean, what do we do about that?
Yeah, so that was actually a really interesting point that you brought up on part of the Imagine a Man project. When the boys had finished their findings, they created a podcast, and that was the majority of what the young men were saying. They do feel that there's so much of a pressure just to be that gender nowadays that they don't feel that anybody kind of recognises the good qualities of a masculine person. So yeah, it's a shame when people like Andrew Tate are constantly in the media. There's only that kind of one focus of somewhere to look for a positive destination, and unfortunately it's not positive.
Do you know that the media do talk a lot about Andrew Tate at the moment? He's always in the news, and some people would suggest that's part of the problem. He's getting so much publicity. I also suspect, right, that when my generation latch on to somebody like that, the moment has passed and your generation have stopped looking at him and are already looking at a load of other people now. I mean, what do you make of Andrew Tate, and how significant an influence is he in your life or the lives of other people around you?
So I feel like he's quite toxic, to be honest. Like, a lot of the points in the way, like, he treats, the way he kind of perceives women is disgusting. And like the way he says about stuff like saying like, you're a man, you need to be like, see how you said the example of like, you need to be the man, like it's bad, like a role model, like you need to be that man, like you need to, what do you call it? Sorry.
No, it's all right. I mean, I get exactly what you're saying. This is what a man should be. This kind of strong,
it's just hard to
dominant.
It's like suck it up, like show no emotion. Like make money. Like you can't do this, you can't do that. Like you need to be the man. Like
everybody's got to be ultra successful, strong, dominant, all that. And actually, you don't. So what is positive masculinity? What version of masculinity are you encouraging young men to see then, Colin?
So again, just going back to the kind of podcast findings and things like that, there was no right or wrong answer for what positive masculinity was, as long as you were just being a nice person. Do you know, if you were a masculine young man, that's not necessarily a toxic trait. Using your power and your dominance is when that would become toxic. But yeah, speak your emotions, speak your truth, do you know, and let's work together to discuss how you're feeling, and we can work with that, do you know, and we can support that, rather than it just being a constant, oh, you're a man, you must be a toxic person.
There's been a lot of talk as well. Gareth Southgate particularly was focusing on the lack of positive male role models. Lots of young men grow up in a home without a father figure in that home. You don't have to be a dad to be a positive male role model, right? But people in your position, youth workers and so on. What should parents, there'll be dads watching and listening to this just now thinking, actually, do you know what, I'm guilty of not knowing what goes on behind that door. What should they be thinking? What should they be doing?
I mean, just it's a hard one, do you know. I don't want to sit here and tell anybody how to do their job and be a good parent, do you know. But just try and leave that door open for communication. Like, being teenagers is hard enough, do you know. But just kind of put the breadcrumbs out there, start the conversation if you're confident enough to do so, and hopefully that will kind of show your young teenage men that you're willing and open to be able to talk these things through with them. Because talking is a lot of the kind of problem, do you know. It's that age-old story: a problem shared is a problem halved.
That is for sure. Colin, before we go, we just spent the first half of this programme talking about lockdown, right? And your generation, we were discussing with Jeane Freeman there, was particularly impacted. Do you think that's contributed a lot?
I think so, yeah. I think it's kind of like promoted the kind of isolation bit, because obviously you were stuck in your house a bit, and then, like, from my point of view, so before lockdown happened, my confidence was starting to get a lot better. Like, I was starting to socialise a lot more, and then next minute, schools are shut, you're not allowed to leave your house. And then the only form of like socialising with your friends is on a gaming console or on the phone, you know what I mean? Like, the only way of actually doing it is actually like sitting in your room, just talking to your pals on the game, and then it kind of keeps you in this wee world, like you're not actually being out there. Yeah,
well listen, I know you've started your own group with young men around your area, you're doing it yourself as well. Well done with that, and thank you very much. I know you were both quite I'm nervous about coming on. I tell you what, you've spoken brilliantly well, and thank you for sharing your thoughts with us. It's a really important subject, and as you say, talking is the most important thing.
Exactly.
Colin McHugh, Conor McKee, thank you very much indeed.
Thank you very
much for coming in. Look, just before we go, let me tell you, Politics Scotland is on your tellies on BBC One Scotland on Wednesday at 2:30. They'll be getting reaction to the Chancellor's spending review statement. Join them for all of that. Join me, same time, same place next Sunday for more of The Sunday Show. If you're with us on the radio or on BBC Sounds, stay tuned. Here's Andrew Black.